Guys, let's take a look at the Financial Review. There's a big financial story on the front page there. Call to end the investment drought is the headline. By Phil Curry is the story. Business is clamouring for tax and other incentives to boost the economy after the mid-year budget update showed slowing growth had wiped more than $22 billion from the budget bottom line and cruelled Scott Morrison's commitment to eradicate net debt by the end of next decade. Now, Scott, this is a real Pandora's box, this story, for so many reasons. The investment environment in Australia, is it fair to say it's uncompetitive by global standards? Or is that being very, very gentle in my euphemism?
I think, look, obviously there's a challenge out there for the government at the moment, and that is the challenge at the moment. Is that, look, Morrison and Frydenberg would argue quite rightly that we're doing better than a lot of the rest of the world. But the MYEFO that came out today did show that that things are slowing, and they've had to wind back their forecasts. And they said, you know, that the surplus, but they are determined to keep that surplus. But there is a challenge out there, and I think the biggest problem they're facing at the moment is they want to keep that surplus, but there's not much else they're willing to do at the moment to preserve that surplus in terms of stimulating the economy. And they're really throwing it back to Phil Lowe at the moment, the Reserve Bank governor, saying, really, you should be doing more. But he's doing his cuts to interest rates at the moment. He's coming back and saying, no, I want the government to do more in terms of fiscal stimulus.
Absolutely.
So, and look, at the moment, we're just tracking along at the moment. We just don't know exactly where we're going to go. But what we do know is the government is determined to keep that surplus and deliver the first surplus in 12 years.
And there's a couple of... I'll just stay with you for a second because there's a couple of points I want to pick up on there. First of all, I mean, monetary policy alone is not going to cut it, and we've known that for a long time. So the government can't be looking to the Reserve Bank in isolation. I mean, that's part of the puzzle, but an ever-shrinking part of the puzzle. The second part I wanted to come back to you on was this idea that at the moment when debt is so cheap, why is the government so fixated on maintaining a surplus? Now, talk to any ethnic person out there and we'll tell you we hate debt, we like cash, typically buried in the backyard. Is the government right in staying fixed on having a surplus no matter how small?
Well, it's interesting to see that the business community out there is kind of slightly mixed messages at the moment. They're saying, yeah, we want you to preserve the surplus. It's important to deliver a surplus, but we wouldn't mind a bit more stimulus as well. So they want to have it each way. I think it's not about necessarily policy in terms of that surplus. There is the politics of that. Clearly, the Prime Minister and the Treasurer are determined to deliver the first surplus in 12 years. There's also probably a very sensible approach in this. If things get worse, if they give up their surplus now and things do get worse, they've got nothing left in the locker
quite right.
in terms of dealing with that in the future. So that is an issue for them as well. So there is the policy reasons to do it, but I think overwhelmingly there is the politics of it, of delivering the first surplus in 12 years, something that Labor talked about doing year after year after year and failed to deliver year after year after year.
Yeah, you're quite right. And Erin, so much of economics is about sentiment as well, and that whole holy grail of delivering that surplus no doubt plays a big part of that. Let's stay on the economy and have a look at the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald for a second, because Shane Wright and Eric Bagshaw are also talking about the economy. Coalition shifts budget strategy is the headline there. The Morrison government has abandoned a key part of its budget strategy, the story says, to give itself more financial firepower to deal with any aftershocks after cutting $22 billion from its forecast surpluses due to that slowing economy that we've been talking about. Erin, you spend a lot of your time in other countries, so I want to ask you, anecdotally at least in your foreign policy role and your foreign relations role, what are people saying about Australia as an investment opportunity, as an investment destination?
Yeah, so on the investment one's really interesting. I think that, you know, what I've seen from people who have global businesses. In fact, I ran into someone in an airport last week and talked about their business in Australia and said the investment environment in Australia is such that we just don't have the scale. It's not attractive. And in fact, they're taking and focusing their business up in a number of Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries. So that was an interesting, I guess, anecdotal conversation that I had. But one of the perceptions about Australia, and I think that, and actually this frustrates me sometimes. I understand the politics of delivering a surplus. It's really important. Look after the economy, and then everything else, like climate change and so on, can be dealt with. But, you know, I've taken 2 trips to Argentina this year. And they
what a shame.
At us like, wow. Oh, well, you know.
Suffer for your art, Erin.
Suffer in my jocks, you know. Suffer with my Malbec and steak on the side of the road while listening to tango in the corner of the street. But, you know, this is a country where inflation is 40%, interest rates are 60%. This was one of, if not the richest country in the world at the turn of the 20th century, and has a very, very similar, I guess, economic or trade environment to Australia and relationships. So, you know, I come back and I go, what do you mean what's wrong with the economy? Yeah. These guys can't they cannot go down to the bank overseas and take out more than $50 US at a time, no more than $200 a month. Can you imagine trying to leave the country? I can't get out the airport with that. So, so that perception of Australia's economy is that we're rich. In fact, we don't use our money well enough. They see, you know, a lot of countries think that, or people I speak to think, well, why aren't you investing more in this or that or the other, or spending more on fixing climate change? That's the big one. When, you know, when we are such a wealthy country, and then I come home and we have these conversations. So it's interesting when you're in that space. And maybe that's, and I'll come back to you, Scott, on this and probably leave the economy here because we've got lots to get through, but it's such a fascinating deep dive into this subject because maybe there's a big part of the perspective that Erin just brought to the table that is so important. But on the flip side, if we're talking about Australia and its role in the Asia Pacific, and as a destination when we're competing against those other countries, we are expensive. We have sovereign risk around the cost of energy and the cost of production, and even the reliability. I mean, it's insane that we're having a conversation about the reliability of energy required to produce stuff in a country like Australia. It seems a nonsense proposition that we're actually here on the verge of 2020.
It was fascinating listening to Erin. That it took me back to my days of doing my economics degree and looking at where Argentina was and the policy decisions and all those things they made at the time and why they got to where they are compared to us. And let's not forget, you know, we've had 28 years of growth here in Australia. Yes. And it's fine to compare us to some of the Asian countries, but we also have a stable economy, a stable government, and certainty here, and often that is not the case. So there is, in some extent, there's an appeal for us in Australia. Clearly there's areas where we could be doing better, and one of the disgraceful things, one of the most disappointing things over the last decade plus is the fact that our power prices now are so high compared to where they once were, and that impacts our economy, you know, and governments of all persuasions have tried to grapple with this and failed, and hopefully the Morrison government will succeed. But that is the biggest issue there. But look, you know, I think it's very interesting to compare us to other nations. We are doing so much better than other nations on a whole series of metrics out there, but clearly there are areas where we could be doing better.
I don't think that one's going away anytime soon, and I reckon we could have spent the rest of the hour talking about it.